From the campus of the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, the Utah Debate Commission welcomes you to the Attorney General Republican Primary Candidate Debate.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's debate with Republican primary candidates running for Utah Attorney General. I'm Glen Mills and it is my pleasure to moderate today's discussion sponsored by the Utah Debate Commission, an organization dedicated to educating voters and encouraging the civil exchange of ideas. The candidates are Derek Brown, Frank Mylar, and Rachel Terry. If you are watching or listening live, you are welcome to send your reactions and questions on social media. All you have to do is use the hashtag UTDebates. The format for this debate is as follows. Each candidate will have a predetermined time to respond to the questions, and on occasion, there will be rebuttal time granted. A random drawing held prior to the debate determining that Mr. Mylar will get the initial response to the first question. We'll then alternate turns on the remaining questions throughout the debate. And now it is time to debate. And in lieu of the traditional opening statement, we're going to offer each of you an opportunity right away to try to differentiate yourselves from the others on the stage. Mr. Mylar, that first question is yours, and it is what about you makes you the most qualified candidate to take this position?
Well, thank you. I'm the most seasoned candidate in this race. I've been practicing law for over 36 years. I'm the only one that's actually worked for over 12 years in the Attorney General's office, and I work for every major every major aspect of that office, including criminal defense. Criminal prosecution, but I've also done criminal defense. I've also been in private practice for over 24 years and done a lot of constitutional cases at all levels of court up to the U.S. Supreme Court, 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and many trial cases. I think that the other thing is that I think that my clients, my opposition, they have some good experiences. Derek's is a lot in the legislative branch, and Rachel's is a lot in the executive branch in different areas. Most of their careers have been in those areas, whereas longer than they've actually practiced law, I've had my own law firm for the last 24 years in addition to the 12 years in the AG's office.
Okay, thank you very much. Mrs. Terry, your turn now. What makes you the most qualified candidate for this position?
Well, first, thank you for organizing this debate, and thank you to everyone who has tuned in and listening and for engaging in the Attorney General's race. The Attorney General impacts every person in the state of Utah. My career has led me to this place where I am ready to hit the ground running as your next Attorney General. I started practicing law about 20 years ago and started in private practice. Then I spent 2 years at the Board of Education, where I prosecuted educator misconduct. I then worked for 7 years at the Attorney General's office, where I got to handle some of the most significant cases in our state's history. I advocated for cities and towns across the state, and now I'm the director of a state agency, where I oversee a large team of attorneys and professionals whose sole responsibility is to protect the state of Utah. I've been doing this work long before there was a title or prestige associated with it. This is the work that I love. This is the work that I want to do, and I will focus on you and the work and nothing else.
All right, Mr. Brown, the final minute on this topic will be yours. What is it that makes you the best candidate for this job?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you to the Debate Commission for all the work that you've done. As I've traveled the state, the most common question I get, interestingly, is what does the Attorney General do? What is the role? And the answer it is your attorney. It matters to you. It matters to families in Utah because you're effectively running the largest law firm in the state of Utah. There's over 500 people that work at the Attorney General's office, which means it requires a combination of legal skills, which I have. I've practiced law for 2 of the most prestigious law firms in the country and clerked for a federal judge. It requires political know-how and work with the press. And I'm the only person here who's been an elected official and has understood those dynamics. I've been legal counsel for 2 United States senators. But more importantly, it requires leadership skills. A lot of you know me from my time serving as chairman of the Utah Republican Party. That's why I've earned the support and endorsement of individuals like both Spencer Cox and Mike Lee for my track record of support.
Okay, thank you very much. Now on to the next question, and the first response will go to Mrs. Terry. Previous administrations have come under intense and extensive criticism from the public for things like associations, the way they manage time, among other issues. What would you do to repair public trust in this office if you were elected?
This question is consistent with what Utahns have been telling me all along, that their biggest concern for the next Attorney General is that it be someone they can trust. And if you want to stay out of trouble, don't go looking for it. It means staying focused on the work and nothing but the work. This is what I want to do. I've been working to advocate and protect Utahns for the last decade and for 20 years of my career. And it also means not bringing conflicts of interest to the office. One of my concerns is that Mr. Brown has been lobbying for some of the very corporations that are being sued and investigated by the Attorney General's office, such as representing Facebook since 2017, which is part of the social media litigation, and also having received money from the tobacco lobby when the Attorney General's office is the one administering the settlement proceeds from the tobacco settlements. Making sure that we have someone in the office who doesn't bring scandal, who doesn't bring conflicts is the beginning to creating a relationship of trust and transparency between the Attorney General and the public.
Mr. Brown, you're up next.
Thank you, I appreciate that. It's not entirely accurate, and frankly, accuracy matters.
So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and give some rebuttal time for this question. But first off, let's start with the question, and then we'll come back and go to rebuttal time for that. But first off, explain what you would do to repair public trust in the office.
Well, I think the critical aspect here is transparency. When I was an elected official, one of the things I learned is you don't just follow the law, and you don't just do what's ethical. There's a higher standard, which is reaching out and having people proactively doing things to create trust for the individuals in the community. And so that's what I would bring to this. When I was in the legislature, in fact, I sponsored a bill specifically dealing with transparency so that individuals know what's going on and understand what takes place in the office. A couple of the other things I did when I both worked with Senator Mike Lee and also that I did when I've worked with other individuals and been an elected official is I've done town halls, I've reached out proactively, I've run a constituent services program, and those are all the kinds of things that you need to do to create trust. It's not enough to simply stay out of trouble. You have to proactively do things which will create trust for the individuals in the state of Utah. And the Attorney General owes it to the citizens.
Okay. Again, we will come back to that previous comment. Mr. Mylar, your thoughts first on repairing public trust in the office.
Absolutely. I think a lot of the problems have stemmed from the different people that support sometimes the candidates. I do not have large corporations. I don't have lobbyists. I don't have all these credit unions, Zions Bank, and all these people are not supporting my campaign. I'm actually not even asking for donations from those groups because you're beholden to them. What's priceless is nobody owns me going into the office. No senator, no legislator, no governor, nobody owns me. I can actually be independent. The other thing is I've been an attorney for almost 37 years now, and actually that's my focus, is being a good attorney and a good independent attorney. And we run conflicts when we have cases in the office. I want somebody in the AG's office to be actually in charge of looking for conflicts across the board, including me, because if someone comes to my table and I've received a donation from them, I either can't take that or I need to send it back.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we'll go to a 30-second rebuttal time. Since Mr. Brown, you were specifically named during that conversation. Respond to Mrs. Terry's words as you see fit.
I appreciate that. And what she said isn't entirely accurate. I don't still represent them. So there is no conflict. And she, of course, knows that. She's hoping, frankly, that you don't know that. But the reality is I did really good legal work for some of the largest companies that operate here in the state of Utah, dealing with one of the most critical issues we have, which is social media. And in fact, the governor and the legislators who've been pushing and advocating to hold them accountable have all endorsed me in this race. So if there's some sort of conflict, it's not something that they're obviously concerned with, because there isn't.
Thank you. Each candidate will get 30 seconds. That's the rules of this debate. So, Mr. Mylar, you will also get an additional 30 seconds on this topic.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think that the biggest thing is I'm not a politician. You know, and we get people into their politicians. They're looking for stepping stones. I've been an attorney my entire career. I'm going to only be an attorney. This is not a stepping stone to some other fancy office, either senator or governor and things like that. I'm probably too old to think about those things, but I'm old enough to have a little bit more wisdom and experience than my competitors, actually a lot more. And I think that is what is going to carry the day in terms of steering clear of these kinds of pitfalls.
Mrs. Terry, 30 seconds for you.
Yes. So again, it's about being focused on the work. And the work of the Attorney General's office is to litigate and defend the state of Utah, which is something that I've done for a decade. And as I've looked at the record, as I have researched the attorneys and the court dockets across the country, there are a lot of cases with my name on it. There are a lot of cases with Mr. Mylar's name on it. We are the practicing attorneys in this race. I have not seen those with Derek Brown's name on them. And it's important that the public understands that when he was representing Facebook, he wasn't representing the children of Utah.
All right, we're going to move on to a new question, and this one is centered around priorities as Attorney General. If you were elected, what would your priorities be, and more importantly, how would you determine what cases you would be willing to take up? Mr. Brown, the first response is yours.
Thank you. There are three issues that I'm focusing on. And first is protecting children, protecting the most vulnerable, protecting those in Utah who are most in need of that help. The second issue is dealing with the overreach of the federal government. This is something that I've dealt with in my private practice as a legislator working for United States senators. The federal government, by and large, is now controlling so much of the state of Utah, and it's the role of the Attorney General to proactively represent the state of Utah and push back against that. And the third thing I would do is bring reforms to this office to increase things like transparency and to increase the resources that they need. This needs to be the most effective, most prestigious, most well-run law firm in the state of Utah. I've worked with the legislature, the Speaker of the House and the Senate President both endorsed me in this race, and I've talked with them about bringing resources to this office if I'm elected. So those are my main three priorities and why I'm running.
Okay, Mr. Mylar, that question now turns to you. How would you determine what cases to pursue?
Sure. The first, the most obvious one to me is reinstating what Title IX is supposed to be. I'm going to defend women's sports, bathrooms, and showers without exceptions. There should not be exceptions. I'm sorry. We can't just, we've got to start looking at the rights of these girls who privacy and religious freedom and their safety is being invaded in the name of political correctness. So that is one thing that I will work hard on. I was listening to a podcast today, a CLE, on this very subject about fighting these issues, and several of the other states are doing it, and we're not doing it here like we need to do it. The other thing is fighting the feds. I've already filed a U.S. Supreme Court brief in April fighting the feds in eastern Utah. So this is not new to me. I will carry that on. The other thing is immigration. People dump people in our state at midnight by airline flights and by bus rides, and we need to stop that. That is nonsense. We need to send them back, but we certainly should not allow it.
Mrs. Terry, talk to us about how you would assess a case and whether or not you would take it up.
Well, my top priority as your Attorney General will be creating trust and transparency in the Attorney General's office. And that means being accessible, open, and responsive for the decisions that I make as your Attorney General. And that includes which cases that we pursue and which ones that we don't. There are criminal cases that are important that we need to prosecute because that is how we will protect children, that's how we protect the elderly, and it's how we keep our streets safe from whether it be prosecuting gang violence or fentanyl or domestic violence or sexual assault. And then the other is fighting the federal overreach in education, in public lands, and in energy. These are the issues that have the most direct impact on our families because when energy is more expensive, it's more expensive for us as family. When we lock Utahns out of public lands, then that means that our agriculture, our energy is put at risk, which is a huge part of the culture and economy of the state of Utah. And I will be accessible and responsive in explaining all my positions as your Attorney General.
All right, turning now to a theme that has already been brought up in this discussion, and specifically TikTok. The state of Utah has recently filed a second suit against the platform, claiming that it allows for young users to be sexually exploited and other illegal activity. If you were elected, how would you pursue this case? And not only this case, but how would you pursue other social media platforms as well? Mr. Mylar, you are the first on this one.
Absolutely. As I pursue these cases, I'm not going to assume that Utah has all the knowledge in the world in in these issues. I'm going to bring in groups that I've worked with before, like the Alliance Defending Freedom, American Family Association, American Center for Law and Justice. These are some of the groups that are actually on the cutting edge of fighting these battles all over the country. I'm an Honor Corps attorney with Alliance Defending Freedom because I've fought a lot of these cases and not charged people for them. They help out these state agencies. And so I'm going to also do that. I solemnly will do everything I can to protect children, not only from being predators on things like TikTok, but also in the libraries of schools. We should not have sexually explicit materials in the schools. And I do believe that there's an AG opinion that was issued on this that's in error. Unfortunately, that AG opinion basically relied upon a minority decision from 3 U.S. Supreme Court justices to try to make policy in Utah. And so we do need to clamp down on that to protect children.
Okay. Mrs. Terry, you're up next. How would you approach the TikTok lawsuit currently underway?
Protecting children from the harms of social media is a top priority. I have 13-year-old twins. And I know, based on talking to them and what their friends are looking at and seeing, that social media is harming our children. And we don't just know that, the social media companies know that. They know, and they have known for a long time, that they are harming children. In fact, that's why the second lawsuit is being brought, is because as the discovery process was being done at the Attorney General's office of the original lawsuit, they discovered that these social media companies know exactly what they're doing. And so in order to fight that, we have to continue this litigation. We need to get at the heart of what they're doing and why. And further to that is making sure that the Attorney General, who's making the decisions and is in the room and deciding how we pursue these kinds of cases, is someone who has never worked for a social media company and it does not have any conflicts as we navigate these important issues to protect our children from online harms of social media.
Mr. Brown, talk to us about how you would approach the TikTok lawsuit and manage potential lawsuits with other platforms as well.
Absolutely. To the extent there's someone in the state of Utah who is an expert and knows exactly what needs to be done on this issue, it's me. These companies hired me as legal counsel. We sat down with the governor, with the legislature, with others, and I'm the one that helped bring them to the table and help hold them accountable. Now, on these lawsuits, I've been asked, would you as Attorney General continue to bring them forward? The answer is absolutely. To the extent that they violated the Utah Consumer Sales Practices Act, they should be held accountable. This is a major issue. And when I said that I have 3 issues that I care about and protecting the most vulnerable is the first one, this is exactly what I was talking about. I have teenagers. I have a daughter who would really like a TikTok account. I, of course, being a bad parent, said, no, that's not what we're going to do. And I think these companies need to be held accountable. And so what we need in the Attorney General is someone who will do that, who will hold them accountable, but who understands the nuances, the legal nuances to do that. And that's something that I've done.
All right, turning now to another lawsuit the state is facing, and this one coming from the Utah Education Association over the Utah Fits All Scholarship, essentially providing vouchers for parents to use for homeschooling or private schooling as well. Now, the UEA's argument is that this violates the Constitution's requirement that education be free and open to all. So the question, the first response goes to you, Mrs. Terry, is how would you address the constitutional challenge brought up by the UEA?
So the UEA lawsuit challenging the voucher bill, I think, is without merit. And as someone who knows education law, and I've been working with educational institutions for the last 10 years. I worked for the Board of Education. I've worked with school districts and universities. I have worked on Title IX cases. And in each of these cases, I've been able to learn and work on these educational issues that matter. And one of them is giving parents choice in the education of their children, because as the name of the scholarship suggests, one size does not fit all for children. Now, in doing that, that means you have to bring the right coalitions together. It means you have to have dealt with constitutional issues, which I have, and know the best way to litigate these issues, because this one is particularly complex because we're dealing with a variety of interests within the state. And as someone who's worked on difficult cases, I've been able to navigate them and bring consensus where it seemed like there could be none reached.
Mr. Brown, talk to us for a minute about your approach to the UEA's challenge?
Now, first of all, and in full disclosure, I really like this bill and I like this policy. I've worked in charter schools. I've chaired a charter school board. I've also worked in the public sector. I'm currently the board chairman for the Foundation for the Utah Schools for the Deaf and Blind. So these issues matter to me. School choice matters. Now, I personally believe that the argument that they're making is without merit, and even though they're trying to hook it onto a constitutional provision in the Utah State Constitution, it doesn't necessarily have merit. That being said, the Attorney General's job is to defend the state and defend it when it is sued. And so this is one of those cases where, as Attorney General, I would absolutely defend the lawsuit. I've even been asked, would you defend a law that you don't like? And the answer is yes. The Attorney General's job is not to pick and choose which laws you like or don't like. The job is to represent the state as their attorney, as their counsel. That's what Article 7 of the Utah Constitution requires. As your Attorney General, in cases like this, that is exactly what I would do.
Thank you. Turning now to Mr. Mylar, your response on how you would address this challenge.
Yeah, the UEA lawsuit is completely bogus. They've done it for political reasons. There's no question about it. They will lose it. I've also defended education and school districts and so on when I was in the AG's office, and so I can tell you that it is bogus and it will not stand. But I will say the UEA, they don't like any of these kinds of bills. Anything that gives competition to what they perceive as their bailiwick, they oppose. They need to get with the program, because I think it was Milwaukee about 30 years ago passed one of these kinds of bills, and Milwaukee has a lot of Democrats in it. So even the Democrats in Wisconsin realized this was good for kids. And that's exactly what this Utah bill is. It's good for kids to have these kinds of choices. We need to make that alive and free for parents to be able to decide what they're going to do with their money. And that's what this is about, their hard-earned tax money, what they're going to do and how they're going to educate their kids.
Our next question is on video. It comes from Dixon Eakins. He is a junior at Utah State University.
Hello, my name is Dixon Eakins, and I'm a junior at Utah State University. Recently, the Utah legislature passed Senate Bill 57, the Utah Constitutional Sovereignty Act. This bill aims to give the state more power in pushing back against burdensome federal regulations. If you are elected to Attorney General, what do you see will be your role in this fight to push back against federal agencies? And where, if any, do you see other potential federal overreach? Thank you.
Mr. Brown, the first response goes to you.
Great. Thank you, Dixon. I appreciate that question. And this is something I've talked about at length. I like this approach. SB 57 is one that I've talked and worked with a number of legislators. The sponsor, Senator Sandel, actually endorses me in this race. And it's because one of the things we need to do as a state is we need to stop having the federal government essentially overreach into things like lands and energy policy. And what this does is it flips the paradigm. It essentially says, if they ask us to do something that violates our 10th Amendment rights, we won't do that. We'll let them file the suit. And then it's up to the Attorney General to represent the state of Utah in that case. The kinds of areas where I would anticipate this taking place, one is in the EPA area, the ozone transfer rule. Federal lands is a huge area of overreach. The Department of Education with things like Title IX, or President Biden basically forgiving unilaterally student loans. Those are the kinds of things that the legislature had in mind. And the state of Utah will be sued because of this. And as Attorney General, I will represent the state ferociously.
Mr. Mylar, your response?
Absolutely. It was Justice Roberts a couple years ago that said states need to start acting like they're sovereigns. This is one of these things where we're acting like it. We need to start doing that. That is part of the pushback. I totally agree with what Mr. Brown said, that this is an important element of that. Further, I see this as an important argument that I can use in lawsuits against the feds. And perhaps it will make the feds have to sue us instead of us always having to defend ourselves against the feds. So I see this as extremely important in this battle. This battle is multifaceted. We always think of it in terms of land, but it's also the Department of Justice trying to take over our schools, trying to tell us how our prisons should be run. They're doing that right now in Utah. And it's also a myriad of other areas that they get involved in that they have no business being involved in, like education, health, and human services. So this is an important pushback, and I'll probably recommend more than just this, actually, as the next Attorney General.
Mrs. Terry.
First of all, thank you, Dixon, for the question. I'm an Aggie. Go Aggies. You know, dealing with federal overreach really is something explicitly that the Attorney General can work on. And this is work that I'm committed to doing. And I'll tell you why. Because when we talk about federal overreach, it seems very abstract. But over the last 6 months, as I've talked to people, it's become a very personal issue. When you talk about the changes to Title IX, and Title IX is something I've worked on extensively throughout my career, we're talking about changes that undermine the original intent and meaning of Title IX. When we talk about federal lands, we're talking about grazing permits. I live in Davis County. Grazing permits aren't a part of my life. But as I talk about these issues with people in rural Utah, and they tell me that when those grazing permits go away, they lose their ranch. When we lose those ranches, we lose those communities, we lose those schools, which means we lose access to so much of our culture and heritage as Utahns. So I am committed to fighting the federal government through litigation and negotiation.
All right, and we have now reached the halfway point of this debate featuring the Republican candidates for Attorney General. Once again, I'm Glen Mills, happy to be here as the moderator. We do encourage you to submit questions during this live broadcast. Use the hashtag #UTDebates on social media, and we will actually get back to the debate with a question that is coming in online, and this comes from Kathy Adams. And that question is, how would you choose legal consultants to work with the AG's office to avoid conflicts of interest? Mr. Mylar.
Yeah, so that is one of the things I've mentioned that I would do, is actually have somebody in charge of these conflicts. I'm aware of that, working for 12 years in the AG's office, worked for 3 different attorney generals. I'm also aware on many times they farm out litigation to downtown Salt Lake, and we pay exorbitant fees for it. I do not want that to happen. Many times we could use a county attorney, and a lot of times that happens with counties. They'll swap things in terms of when there's a conflict. So I do not want to just waste a lot of money, and it's millions. It goes into the millions that the AG's office pours out into the private sector to defend suits that it should be doing. The other thing I'll do a lot of is bring in the expertise of groups, like I said, like Alliance Defending Freedom and some of those others that will help very much in a lot of this litigation. And sometimes they can completely take over the case. Obviously, I would still have the ultimate oversight, but that would be greatly help that situation.
Mrs. Terry, your thoughts?
Yeah, so this is an issue that I've been working on for a long time, especially when I was at the Attorney General's office. And now I'm the director of a state agency that works with the Attorney General's office on litigation and finding and first, I want to say that we are so lucky to have such exceptional attorneys and staff and investigators at the Attorney General's office who are carrying a heavy load and investigating hard cases. And I've done that with them, and I want to continue to do that with them. And the way that we select people to do work on the outside and it's rare, it doesn't need to be done very often, is you identify someone who has a particular expertise in the area that you need. Now the question being, how do you avoid conflicts? That's something that attorneys do every day as they navigate their practice. It's identifying areas where you may have a relationship with someone who's involved in the case. And that's why I'm uniquely qualified to be in this position, because my only client for the last 10 years has been the people in the state of Utah. So I won't bring any personal conflicts to this role.
Mr. Brown, the final response to this question is yours.
I appreciate this. Having practiced law in 2 of the largest law firms in the world, I'm very familiar with how this happens. We have almost 300 attorneys in the Attorney General's office. And so we have attorneys coming and going on a regular basis. And so dealing with conflicts it's a very simple process. We do it all the time. Those of us who've worked in the private sector extensively understand how it is that we do this. And frankly, I have been hired by some of the largest, most influential companies on the planet. And I know there are those that say, well, then maybe you would have a conflict. Well, I'm not currently representing them, so of course I wouldn't. But I would say you probably don't want an attorney general who doesn't have that kind of background, who doesn't have conflicts, because it means they haven't really been hired by the kind of people that are bringing the real cases, the real meat of what's going on here. So the other thing I would mention is that there's an audit taking place. I look forward to one of the things that will be discussed in that audit is how things like this, these kind of conflicts, can be better resolved, because I'm always looking for ways to improve things.
We are going to dig now into the Dobbs case, of course, in that the United States Supreme Court returning the regulation of abortion procedures back to states. Since then, we have seen really a wide range of new laws varying from state to state, causing some concern even among Republican voters. So the question tonight is, do you believe that states should control abortion laws? And if so, how do you go about enforcing them? Mrs. Terry.
So I am pro-life, and I support the laws that have been passed in the state of Utah. And this issue is particularly relevant and important to me because of my personal experience. When I was pregnant with my twins, there were some abnormalities on the ultrasound, and the doctor suggested that we consider evaluating an abortion. But we were far enough along in that pregnancy that I knew those two. And we had already bonded, and that has informed how I look at our pro-life debate, while also being deeply respectful of the fact that each woman needs to identify and sort through these issues for themselves. I agree with the Supreme Court, who has said that this should be a state-based issue. And in Utah, we support families. We believe that being pro-life means being able to create your own family in your own time and in your own way. And I will defend and support the laws of the state of Utah, because that is my job as your Attorney General, is to support and defend what your legislators have passed at your request.
Mr. Brown, should abortion rights laws be handled at the state level, and how do you go about enforcing them?
The answer is yes, and I appreciate that question. My wife and I also have very personal experiences on this issue, and without getting into those, I will say that this issue matters to me, not just from the ethical and moral standpoint, but the Dobbs decision basically gave the decision-making on this issue back to the states, which is where it should have been all along. As a constitutional conservative myself, I always had issues with the fact that the federal government, the Supreme Court, effectively took it away from the states. And so my job, as I view it as Attorney General, is defending the state. We currently have state laws on this that are at the Supreme Court. But one of the other areas we need to be very careful about is the fact that the federal government, particularly HHS, has tried to reinterpret regulations to override state statutes. That is exactly the kind of thing that an Attorney General needs to push back on behalf of the state. And as Attorney General of Utah, as pro-life as I am, this is absolutely something that I will do.
Mr. Mylar.
Yes, I'm absolutely pro-life, and I will vigorously defend the pro-life laws that we passed in Utah. In fact, a year ago, I actually filed a brief with the Utah Supreme Court representing pro-life OB/GYN doctors in defending that statute that was passed. I've been throughout my practice, I've helped also in the other part of this, that is with pregnancy resource centers, pregnancy care centers across the state. I often give them free legal help and free legal assistance. And I often meet with women that don't know whether to have an abortion or to adopt. In fact, one woman said, if I don't meet with an attorney to talk to, I'm going to abort this child the next day. I was able to scramble my schedule and meet with that woman, and she decided to actually have the child after we talked. And so I think that we need to look at really being in the trenches. We need to care for these women through places like the Pregnancy Resource Center, but we also need to be pro-life.
We talked a little bit earlier in the debate about restoring trust to the office. Now we're going to broaden that out a little bit and talk about the criminal justice system as a whole across the country. A Gallup poll back in 2023 found that only 17% of Americans describe having a great deal of confidence in the justice system. What would you do to try to restore this trust and change that around, Mr. Brown?
Thank you. I appreciate that. And those kind of statistics are very disturbing to me, because one of the things we need to maintain in our country is trust in our institutions, trust in the elections process, trust in the judicial process. And this is something that we've seen. And with the recent verdict against President Trump, there's been a lot of concern about whether that was truly a guilty verdict or whether it was simply the fulfillment of a campaign promise. And so those are the kind of things that undermine that trust. As Attorney General, I will work closely with our county attorneys and our county sheriffs. As Attorney General, I'm accountable to you, but they're also accountable to you. They need resources. They need the backing of the Utah Attorney General as well. And that's one of the things that I will do as Attorney General, is work with them closely so that we can have a judicial system that people respect, that they have trust in, and that we can roll back what we've seen is sort of this disintegration of the trust that we have, because that is so critical to have in our society.
Mr. Mylar, talk about restoring trust to the U.S. criminal justice system.
Yes, this is something that I'm very familiar with. I have far more criminal law experience than anyone else standing here, not only as a prosecutor, but also defending. And I think that's very important that I've done criminal defense as well as criminal prosecution, because you get to see both sides of the aisle. I actually once defended pro-life sidewalk counselors when they were criminally prosecuted in Salt Lake City. It went to trial and we won. And so that's, I think it's very important as we look at these issues to see, okay, what can we do to improve the criminal justice system? Yes, we do not want to let criminals out that are dangerous. During COVID, ACLU brought a suit to have a lot of them released. I represented nearly every county in the state, except for Salt Lake County, in defending that lawsuit so they would not have to release these dangerous inmates into society. It went to the Supreme Court, and we won that suit. And I'm already work with sheriffs all over the state, and most of them have endorsed me, and many county attorneys as well.
Restoring trust in the U.S. criminal justice system. Mrs. Terry.
Yes. So making sure that people have trust in our judicial system is a core tenet to making sure that our nation works and thrives. And part of that means that the criminal justice system needs to do what it's supposed to do, which is protect the people of Utah. When we have domestic violence cases where the perpetrator is being leaving the prison before the victim can even give her statement, people don't feel safe. When we see more drugs and more criminals on our street, but we're prosecuting police, people don't feel safe. And one of the roles of the Attorney General is to oversee and evaluate what our county attorneys are doing and making sure they have the resources and the consistency in how the judicial system is applied. And that is something that I'll work on with our sheriffs, many of whom have endorsed, and with our county attorneys, many of whom have endorsed me. And as your Attorney General, I will fight to keep you safe.
We're turning now to another question coming in on social media. This one will not require a minute response, but a 30-second response to maybe describe a little bit as to why. But Anthony Bishop is asking, who will you vote for president and for governor? Mr. Mylar, you are first.
Yes, these are the fun questions, right? Well, first of all, I'm absolutely voting for President Trump, and I know that there's a lot of Republicans that are questioning that. I think they need to look at his record. His record was amazing, and I don't care what you say about whether you like him or not, you look at what he actually did. And I hate to say this, but on terms of the governor, I was very offended when Governor Cox vetoed the women's sports bill 2 years ago. That is very, very troubling to me, and I think I'd have to go with Phil Lyman.
Mrs. Terry?
So I endorse and support President Trump, and I will be voting for him. And it's because we need his help in Utah to address the abuses of the Antiquities Act in our public lands, to address the way Title IX has been reversed, to address our energy issues. And those are the things I want to work on with the Trump administration, also attorneys general from across the country who will be my colleagues. When it comes to the governor's race, as I've told people, I remain neutral because I work under the governor, and so it felt inappropriate to be stepping out and making any kind of endorsement in the governor's race.
Mr. Brown.
I'm willing to actually tell you where I stand on both of these issues. First of all, I absolutely will support President Trump only because he has such a good track record in terms of the policies that he advocated for. I mean, I don't always like the way he speaks. Most of us don't. But we can do so much more as a state if he is in the White House. I also support Governor Cox. He has a conservative track record. He's supported by so many here because of that. And so I'm happy to support him as well. So thank you for the question.
The next question is centered around consumer protection laws. In general, they give attorneys a fairly broad legal authority to request a wide range of records when investigating businesses or charities for potential fraudulent practices. Some AGs have even used the same authority to probe the practices or motivations of organizations that advocate for such things as abortion access, gender transition services, and so on. So the question tonight is, or this afternoon, is do such practices infringe on free speech or protections against illegal search and seizure? Mrs. Terry.
So we have to strike the right balance when it comes to these, to the broad prosecutorial and investigative power that the Attorney General has. And as your Attorney General, I will be the lead investigator and prosecutor for the entire state, which means I will be particularly sensitive to your constitutional rights as we conduct this duty. Now, when it comes to small businesses and advocacy organizations, sometimes an investigation needs to be done, but sometimes it's politicized in order to identify donors and supporters so that they can be outed, if you will, for their support and their work, and that's not appropriate. We've seen cases to this extent come through the Supreme Court, and making sure that we respect the First Amendment rights and privacy rights and handle these things in a way that doesn't politicize and further doesn't undermine people's confidence in the judicial system, in their law enforcement system when we're just going after. In fact, there's a bill that's created that Congress is working hard to address that creates far too big of a dragnet on these issues.
Okay, Mr. Brown, talk about broad legal authority and its impact on freedom of speech and illegal search and seizure.
I appreciate that, and this is a great question because one of the unique things about Utah is the Division of Consumer Protection isn't technically underneath the Attorney General's office. In most states it is. In our state it's not. The legislature has chosen to remove it. That being said, they do rely on the legal counsel and legal advice provided by that office. I've worked with that office at length in my legal practice, representing companies and helping understand and strike this balance. But I believe it is critical that we understand that whoever is in the Attorney General's office understands that there has to be a balance. You've got to use the powers of that office delicately, professionally, and responsibly. As I've always said, the power to prosecute is the power to destroy. And you need to be extremely careful as a prosecutor when you are using that power. And so these kinds of broad record requests should be infrequent, and they should be done carefully and infrequently.
All right, thank you. Mr. Mylar, you have the final minute on this question.
Absolutely. So I did work in the Attorney General's office dealing with consumer fraud. The Attorney General is responsible for prosecuting the consumer fraud. So yes, there's an agency, but that agency gives that information to the Attorney General's office, and they determine whether to prosecute. So there's definitely some legal oversight of that agency because of that. And I will tell you this, I am very sensitive to whether organizations are violating the First Amendment. I've fought many First Amendment cases. I've defended them, and I've also prosecuted them against the state and local governments. I actually spoke out at Senator Hatch's Judiciary Committee years ago regarding FISA and the Section 702 eavesdropping on citizens. And I also know that my worst threats, nightmares came true when Janet Reno started using that, weaponizing it. And now we've got the FBI weaponizing these things. So we need to be very, very careful. Is the government overreaching in the name of trying to prosecute?
All right, now we are turning to fentanyl. It is a deadly issue impacting many Utahns and people across the country. It is cheaper, more potent, and more widely available than ever before. So if you were elected as Attorney General, how would you work with federal, state, and local partners to combat this issue? Mr. Brown.
Thank you. I appreciate this. These are the kinds of issues I worked on at length when I was legal counsel for 2 United States senators. The problem with fentanyl is that we have now confiscated, at this point in the year, more than we confiscated all of last year combined. And the problem with that now is that we are seeing deaths by the hundreds, by the thousands. And as the Attorney General, you need to work with local law enforcement. I have sheriffs, I have individuals that support me, including our U.S. Attorney during both Trump and Obama, John Huber. And I've talked at length about these kinds of issues with my team. And let me tell you, the most important thing a leader can do is not be a know-it-all, but can simply bring in the best and the brightest to advise. And my style of leadership is collaborative. The best results we can have to stop the flow of these drugs into Utah is to collaborate with law enforcement, legislative officials, and others who have a vested interest in stopping this flood.
Mr. Mylar, talk about your approach to the fentanyl crisis.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, the illegal aliens coming into the state are actually increasing it, is what the statistics are showing. And so we need to close the faucet of them being dumped here. That is actually part of fighting it. And I do agree with Mr. Brown that we do need to talk to the sheriffs, because the sheriffs and county attorneys are on the front lines of fighting these issues. Now, I speak and teach almost every year at the Utah Sheriff's Association Conference. I've also taught at the Utah Prosecution Council. And so this is something that I'm already entrenched in doing. It's not going to be something I need to get up to speed on. Most of the sheriffs do respect me and endorse my campaign. And I'll have no problem in helping lead and help them do what they need to do in fighting fentanyl, because it is not primarily the job of the AG's office to fight fentanyl. It is primarily my job, though, to show leadership and to help us work as a cohesive unit in fighting this all across the state.
Mrs. Terry, your thoughts on fighting the fentanyl crisis?
The first thing we have to do to fight the fentanyl crisis is to stop it coming from into our country. And it's coming in because the border is not secure. And we know that this is where the drugs are coming from. We know that they're being produced in China and brought through the Mexican-U.S. border. And so the first thing we've got to do is secure the border. And the way I am involved in that as your Attorney General is to work with other Attorneys General from across the country in litigation to force the application of existing U.S. laws at the border. And that means supporting Texas in their fight to secure their own border. And I'm grateful for the support and endorsement of the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, with whom I will work on these immigration and on the border security issues. But it also means providing more resources to our sheriffs and our counties who are at the front lines in dealing with fentanyl, and making sure that those who are bringing it in, who are selling it to our children, are prosecuted and incarcerated.
All right, let's talk now about open records and specifically the Attorney General's calendar. Back in April, the State Records Committee ruling unanimously that it is indeed a public document under the state's open records law. Do you think the Attorney General's office calendar is a public document? Mr. Mylar.
Absolutely. I don't know why we would want to hide that. It's what the taxpayers pay me to do, to be the Attorney General, and that is part of the business that I do, and it should be open to the public. Now, if I go on a private vacation to Mexico, nobody needs to know about that. But if it has to do with anything whatsoever related to the office, the public should have access to that. And that's true, I think, with most public records. The public should not be put through some difficulty to try to get public records. Sometimes they say they put exorbitant fees for the public to be able to get those records. There needs to be more allowance in terms of waiving those fees than there currently is. And they shouldn't have to litigate and fight these things out in the court. There are sometimes reasons to protect personal records, and we need to honor those because of the rights of those parties that we're actually protecting. But all in all, it should be easier than it is to get records in general, and the AG's office needs to be very clear on what they're doing.
Thank you. Mrs. Terry, your thoughts? Should the AG's calendar be a public document?
So that case is currently in litigation, and I'm looking forward to the court's ruling on that. The Government Records and Management Administrative Act, GRAMA, if you will, is an important part of transparent government. It means that you as citizens get to see what your government is doing. And that sunshine is the best disinfectant for corruption and other problems that can happen in government. As your Attorney General, I will be the most transparent, accessible, and responsive Attorney General you've ever had. I'm already doing that as a candidate. I can't tell you how many times people have called me, and I pick up the phone and I answer their questions, even if I know they won't like my opinion, because they deserve to know where I stand on any given issue. I will have town halls. I will disclose my calendar. I will have a constituent services office, because being accountable to you, being responsible for the decisions that I make and explaining why I'm making them is how I can be the best leader possible.
Mr. Brown, your thoughts on the AG calendar and public records?
Thank you. And I think your exact question, which wasn't answered, is it a public record? Now, I think the answer is it is, but the better question probably is, should it be? And more specifically, if I were the Attorney General, would I disclose that information? The answer is yes. As a Supreme Court justice long ago said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. I believe that. And when I was in the legislature, I sponsored and voted for transparency laws. I helped write some of the transparency laws that we have now. And I believe that's the way that you create an environment of trust where people understand what it is you're doing. I've had people that have said to me in the past years, well, the press may be out to get you, be careful. No. The press just wants to know what's going on. The public just wants to know what's going on. The way you facilitate that is you create an open environment where things like calendars are made available and people know what you're doing. And that's why I've said I'll do exactly what I did before when I served in the House of Representatives. I'll have town halls. I'll respond to constituent emails. I'll have constituent services. I'll do all the things that if elected officials do.
All right, thank you very much. We are down to our last question now. We'll have about 20 seconds each on this one, and it's a simple question. Should the Attorney General be appointed or elected? Mrs. Terry.
The Attorney General should and always be elected so that we don't eliminate your voice as the public. You are the one who gets to hire and fire. But it's important that your Attorney General also has some space from both the legislature and the governor's office, which is difficult here in this particular election when Mr. Brown is being entirely funded almost by the governor and the legislators.
We're really tight on time. Sorry about that. Mr. Brown, your thoughts?
Thank you. The answer to the question is it should always be elected. This is how people are accountable to, the Attorney General is accountable to the people, is you've got to have that level of connection and accountability. And so I believe that Utah does it right, just like 43 other states with us, that the Attorney General should be an elected position. That way they're accountable to you.
Mr. Mylar, appointed or elected?
It should absolutely be elected. It is a citizen's attorney. It is not the governor's, it's not the legislature. And I think you have to worry a little bit on some of these endorsements on whether they're already beholden to some of these people that have endorsed them. You will know for a fact that I'm not beholden to anyone, that I represent the citizens of the state.
We have now reached the end of the debate, a random drawing held earlier determining that the first closing statement would go to Mrs. Terry. Now, Mrs. Terry, your closing statement.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to be on the stage. Thank you for everyone who's engaged with me in the past 6 months, who's watching this debate. As my family and I have traveled the state, we have talked to thousands of Utahns, and they have made their message to me consistent and clear. What they want is an Attorney General who will be independent, who will fight for them, and who will remain transparent and be someone that they can trust every day. This is the work that I've been doing for the last 10 years. This is the work I want to keep doing. This isn't a stepping stone to another position. This is the work that I care about as your Attorney General. I will remain independent while I will work collaboratively with the governor's office, with the legislator, with universities, school districts. I will remember that you are my clients. As I work to fight federal issues and protect children, I will remember that you are my clients. I don't want to be your politician general. We have plenty of politicians. I want to be your Attorney General, and I will focus on the work and nothing else.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. 1 minute.
Thank you, and thank you to so many of you who have participated in this process, and to my opponents and to the Debate Commission for doing this. I've been asked, why are you running? There's 4 reasons. Alex, Zach, Eliza, and my little special Spencer. I worry, those are my kids, I worry about our state. I worry what kind of state we are going to bequeath to them. And I know that you worry about that as well. We right now have a brief window of time with the Supreme Court where we can actually push back in a way that lets Utahns make Utah decisions and not federal bureaucrats. I have received the support, the endorsement of not only the Speaker of the House and the Senate President, but Senator Mike Lee and Governor Cox, 2 people who don't always see eye to eye. I've earned their trust. I hope to earn yours as well. My name is Derek Brown. I'm running for Attorney General, and I would appreciate your vote. Thank you.
Mr. Mylar, your closing statement.
Thank you. It cannot be denied that I do have far more legal experience than my competitors. But one thing that's very different from me than them, more than that, is the kinds of cases that I've handled the last 24 years as a private attorney. I've handled numerous cases where I've vindicated people's constitutional rights. Many times I did not charge them a dime for it. And you have to think about, everyone can say these great things. I'm going to fight for this, I'm going to fight for that. Why haven't they been fighting for them? they've been attorneys for like 20-some years. Why didn't they bring one case to try to vindicate somebody's constitutional rights? The reason I'm running for Attorney General is because I know I can do a lot more to protect people's rights if I'm the Attorney General. We didn't hear anything during COVID. There's a number of things that we are just missing out on by having an attorney that will truly advocate for your rights. So please vote for Frank Mylar for Attorney General. Thank you.
All right. Thank you to all of you for this very important conversation. We appreciate your time here today, being with us and expressing your views to the people of Utah who will be voting in this election. We also want to thank you for being willing to get involved in public service. It's a very important part of our community. And we do want to remind all of you out there that Tuesday, June 25th is Election Day. Make sure to get out and vote. Your ballot should have been sent right to you. You can easily fill it out and put it back in the mail or put it in a drop box at various locations throughout your county. You can also show up for early voting options and on Election Day as well if that's what you would like to do. Just contact your county clerk to get all the information you need to make sure your voice is heard. It's an important civic duty, and we hope that you will exercise it. We do greatly appreciate PBS Utah for donating the production facilities to broadcast this very debate and many others. We are also grateful for the Larry H. and Gail Miller Family Foundation, Zions Bank, the George S. and Dolores Dory Eccles Foundation, and the Stewart Family Foundation for their generous support of the Utah Debate Commission. None of this would be possible without all of that crucial support. This debate and many others from previous years are available online. You can find them at utahdebatecommission.org. Once again, I am Glen Mills. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation, and we hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone, by the way. They don't pay you enough. They should double your pay, all of you. That way you get twice as much as I got when I was on the debate commission. Although we should have got more back in 2022 when it was just like, Okay,
we're good to proceed.
Are we good? All right. Who wants to go? Hannah?
Yeah, can you please clarify what you did with Meta?
Absolutely. So a couple of years ago, the governor made a statement, a very public statement. He said, look, we've got an issue. We got to solve this issue. Social media is absolutely an issue with our kids. And out of 8,000 lawyers in the state of Utah, Meta hired me. And what I did is I went to them and said, listen, I'm going to tell you not what you want to hear, but what you need to hear, because that's what a good lawyer does, is you tell people what they need to hear. And so I brought them to the table. We worked with legislators, we worked with the governor's office, we worked with constitutional experts to create a series of bills that gave parents the tools that they needed to actually help with their kids on social media. So I'm proud of the work that we did. I mean, obviously I have an opponent who's trying to make an issue of it, but I don't currently represent them, so this idea that there's some sort of conflict, it doesn't quite understand the way things work in the real world. The reality is we created a system of laws here in Utah that are the first in the country. They're groundbreaking. I'm proud of the work we did, and in fact, not only the governor who went after social media companies, but the legislators who did as well, all have endorsed me in this race. And so I feel like we've got a great result. I feel very, I'm proud of what we've done. And I know that other states are looking at us and watching what we're doing. And some are replicating because we got a good result. And I might add that there's some really tricky legal issues that we had to deal with, in particular issues involving the First Amendment. But that's what lawyers do. And I've represented some of those companies. So, yeah.
Having advised them, though, is it appropriate for you to be at the helm of the ongoing litigation?
Absolutely. And to the extent that we need to, what we do in the AG's office is you set up what we call conflicts walls. And we have attorneys, as I mentioned, coming and going all the time. And what we do, it's very common. For instance, there's a death warrant that's been issued, and they've set up a series of walls with BOP and corrections and others. And there's a process for how you deal with that. And so I've also said that I will continue with this lawsuit because I think it's critical that if a company has violated the Consumer Sales Protection Act, they should be held accountable. And as Attorney General, I'll make sure that they are.
So you were advising them, you were giving them legal advice, but you still feel like they potentially broke the law?
Well, the advice that I gave them was specific to the laws that were passed by the legislature. So I wasn't working on this other. So that's another reason why this is really just kind of a non-issue, is I wasn't working on the issues involving this particular law. So, I mean, and this is very common. Conflicts of interest issues are very common in the legal world. I worked in a law firm with 1,800 attorneys. We dealt with conflicts all the time. And so my core responsibility as Attorney General is protecting children, protecting the most vulnerable, and that's exactly what I will do. Every decision I make will be to that end.
At the end of the debate, Rachel Terry kind of said, question whether you have the independence because of all the support that you keep bringing up from the governor, from the legislature. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, my support comes from all over the place. Now, the reality is when people complain about other people's endorsements, I think what they're really complaining about is the fact that they didn't get the endorsement to begin with. I've been endorsed by the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, the Governor, Senator Mike Lee. They don't always agree on issues. They simply don't. And they know that. So this idea that I could be beholden to one person or the other simply isn't the case. I mean, it belies the facts, because when you have a large group of people, including most of the Republicans in the legislature, also endorse me. So the reality is they endorse me because they know I'm independent-minded. And I love the fact that we have in our government, in the executive branch, what I call a fractured executive, which means that we have checks and balance not only among the branches, but within the executive branch. And so I feel strongly that that's a good system, and that way the Attorney General has a measure of independence and always will.
Piggybacking off that, your opponent also mentioned where your funding is coming from for the race. Would you like to address that?
I have funding from all different sources. What I did when I was an elected official is I said, look, I'm happy to take support from wherever it comes from. And I also said, and this is kind of a funny phrase, but I would say it, I'd say to people that donated, I will likely disappoint you. And they'd say, what does that mean? I'd say, well, the reality is I'm going to vote with my conscience. And I've said the same thing in the course of this campaign. I've said to people, look, I will always go with what I believe is the right thing to do. And so I've had big donors, small donors, family members, non-family members, people I've known for 40 years, people I've never met. I have a broad base of support all across the political spectrum. And I think that reflects positively on who I am. I think that sends a message more than having one or two big donors or one or two big companies like one of my opponents. I mean, I think the reality is the broader the base of support, the less beholden you could say anyone is to anything. And plus, I've got a good track record. I've got a track record. You could look at what I've done in the past, the work that I've done. I have a track record of not being beholden to anyone, but to following my conscience and voting and acting in accordance with that, regardless of where funding comes from.
So even though you've got donations, some donors giving $10,000, $20,000, $50,000, you don't feel like that gives them special access?
Not at all. Large donations gave nobody special access. In fact, everybody has special access because anybody that calls me, I pick up the phone and I talk with them. And these are not people who have asked anything in return. The only thing that people have said that they wanted when some people have given me donations is just act with integrity, act with honor, act in a way that we can be proud of the office. That's all I ask. And my commitment is to do exactly that.
How would you restore integrity to the office given how much controversy has been surrounding it?
Transparency. Transparency is the key. To the extent that the people of Utah know what I'm doing, there will be trust. To the extent the press knows what the office is doing, there will be trust. And I have a track record of sponsoring bills that deal with creating transparency. In fact, one of the bills that I sponsored when I was in the House, I think it was SB 137, dealt with putting a series of government records dealing with interlocal agencies just on the web. So that instead of having, instead of the press having to file a grandma request, you just go to transparent.utah.gov and the records are all there. And so that's always been my attitude. It was in the legislature, it is now, that the more public records we can put online so it's easily accessible, the more that you create a sense of trust, the more that you create sort of that trust that you're referring to in the office. I think the more that people know what's going on, and the more not just that you do the right things or the ethical things or the legal things, but that you proactively do things that create trust. I mean, that's why as an elected official, one of the things I did was have town halls on a regular basis, deal with constituent affairs on a regular basis, and do things that would put me in contact with the voters. And the more that you're in contact with the voters, the better you are at being transparent, and the more you have that feeling of trust.
One of the questions Glenn asked was about reforming the criminal justice system. Yeah. And you said it's important to have trust in the institutions, but then you also questioned the validity of the Trump prosecution. Can you how do we square that?
And how do you thread that? I think the reality is,
on one hand, raising issues with the
well, I think it's worth mentioning that we have someone who literally campaigned on a promise to go after another individual. As someone who cares deeply about the judicial process, that gives me some heartburn. I'm the one candidate in this race who's worked in the judicial system. I spent part of my career working for a U.S. Court of Appeals judge, specifically on appellate issues. And it dealt with everything from antitrust to criminal law to any of the issues that the Attorney General deals with. So I believe it's important for us to have that trust. And I think what's going to happen here is that there is a sentencing process. The sentencing will take place, I think it's July 11th, is that right? And then the president has 30 days under New York law to appeal the case. He's going to appeal. And I think that's how you create that sense of confidence and trust in the legal system is you're going to see it in the appeals process, because sometimes the trial court can get bogged down in some of these issues like that we're talking about. But the idea of an appeals is that the appellate judges are able to be removed and distant from the process. And so I think that we'll see, it's entirely possible we see a different result at the appellate level.
Did you have trust in the verdict?
Yes, I do.
Do you think he broke the law then?
Well, according to the verdict and according to the trial, he did. So end of story. And now whether it stands on appeal is another issue. But as far as the law goes, we have to have faith and trust in those institutions. Are we time?
Just one more.
One more. Make it good. This is the last one, it sounds like, so.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Where are some areas of the justice system that you currently see unfairness that you want to address?
One of my biggest issues, and I went to a meeting with a nonprofit that's involved with the Utah Bar, but it's access to the legal system. I have always had heartburn, just personally and professionally, over the fact that most of our litigants either have $500 an hour attorneys or legal clinics, free legal clinics, and nothing in between. And for me, that's a real problem. Now, the legislature tried to address this by having sort of a legal apprentice program where you could have someone who's not a lawyer involved in things like debt collection or landlord-tenant or that sort of thing. But one of the things that I would like to address, and I will absolutely work with the Utah State Bar on, is the ability to create much more accessibility for everyone, for our legal system. Because as much as we'd like to think that there's great access, there's a lot more access if you have more resources. And sure, the bar does free legal clinics, and I've worked with them on stuff like that, but the reality is, for everyone else in the middle, it leaves this gap. And so I hope to help close that gap.
Thank you very much.
All right.
So we're beginning with the Mylar. Anybody associated with the other campaign staffers should be out of the studio now. I think they are, yes. You good?
No lurking behind the signs. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, we're good. Go.
First?
Sure. Tell me about the Trump verdict, Frank.
Well, I say that is one of the biggest miscarriages of justice that we've seen in a long time. And I'll tell you why, a couple of reasons. One, the judge instructed the jury that they did not need to be unanimous on all aspects of the verdict. That is plainly unconstitutional. There were numerous evidentiary rulings throughout the trial, and almost all of them were denied, which is unheard of. Usually you see at least some parity. I mean, you could go on and on and on. This is something that should frighten everyone in this country, what New York did. But it's no different than what the state of Colorado did when they took Trump off the ballot, even though he's running for a federal office. And so what they did was so ridiculous. Yet they are smart people on their Supreme Court, but apparently they hate Trump so much, they're going to disregard the law and take him off. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that was wrong to have done that. I believe that's also going to happen when this Trump verdict gets up to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it might take a while.
Can you address address some other areas of unfairness that you see in the justice system?
Sure. I mean, there's some chronic unfairness, I'll tell you the truth, because a lot of times when I'm representing somebody, I feel like I'm doing a very zealous job, and sometimes it's not. The other attorney might not be as zealous. There could be a lot of reasons for that. That sometimes is concerning. Sometimes I think laws, when they have mandatory sentences, is because they don't trust the judges, or it may be that the legislator or Congress wants to make it feel like they're doing something, and so they decide, let's just add more years onto this. Well, not all offenses need more years added onto it. That's not necessarily the best thing to do. So, and sometimes I see a tendency to want to criminalize more activity or just increase levels. Now, we all know an assault is an assault, and that's dangerous and that's bad, and you need to incarcerate somebody. But when you're not talking about dangerous offenses, I think sometimes we need to take a different approach.
One of the things that caught my attention, you mentioned potentially letting outside groups take the lead on some constitutional issues. You
Sure.
mentioned specifically the Alliance for Defending Freedom,
Right.
which is, as I understand it, a Christian backed group,
Yes.
James Dobson's organization.
Mm-hmm.
Is that an appropriate role for the state to be letting a Christian group take the lead on litigation?
Yeah, well, this group, by the way, was started by people that worked in under President Reagan in the Justice Department. These are the utmost professionals that have worked in their firms. And they handle cases regardless of what somebody's religious beliefs might be. Many times these are First Amendment cases. And so I think that, number one, the Attorney General is always where the buck stops. And so whether you use a downtown law firm and pay them a lot of money, or you use someone like the Alliance Defending Freedom, it's still the Attorney General that's in charge. And there's going to be people of different faiths in the AG's office. I'm not going to screen people off just because they're Christians or religious, the same way. I will say this, though, that the state of Idaho, they actually had the Alliance Defending Freedom defend their pro-life laws in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. Also, there's 6 of the 9 Title IX cases that have been filed to protect women's sports are actually being brought by the Alliance Defending Freedom. So it's a common thing for the Alliance Defending Freedom to help states in this regard. So they can do that in a way that is not violating anyone's First Amendment rights.
One of the things they've opposed in the past is same-sex marriage, and now with the Dobbs decision, there's some question about whether that Obergefell could also be revisited. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah.
And what would you do as Attorney General in
Well,
that regard?
I will say this. I know there's a lot of people that wanted there to be federal laws on a lot of things. They wanted a federal ban of abortion. I actually feel like constitutionally and from a federalist perspective that's not the best way to look at things, that actually what they did in Dobbs was return the issue to the state. I think anything that deals with health and welfare, marriage, you name the issue, education, all of those things are primarily state issues. Now, mostly this is something for Congress or the legislatures, because I'm not going to be passing any laws. But I will be enforcing laws or weighing in if I think they're unconstitutional. But from a practical standpoint, I do think there's many things that are uniquely state law concerns, like abortion, and I would say that with the case of marriage and a lot of different subjects.
How would you go about defending a law that you disagree with?
Well, there's a difference between disagreeing and it being unconstitutional. I was asked this question in another debate, and I said, I'm not going to defend a law that's unconstitutional. And that's something that is something I've done in the past, where I've said, look, we can't defend this. This isn't defensible. We need to resolve this. So that's one thing. Now, if there's a law that I just disagree with, and we're not talking about it being constitutional or not, you need to put aside those things as Attorney General and be able to be independent and say, we still need to vigorously fight this. And I had this practice when I for a short time, I worked at the Army Missile Command in Huntsville, Alabama. And I was on the prosecutions team initially, and then they switched me to defense. The attorneys that were in the defense were worried, oh, this guy's only a prosecutor. They are actually quite relieved when they realized I put the same zeal into doing criminal defense that I actually did in prosecuting, and to help that person get his fair shake in the law. Because that's the best way the system works, when you have excellent advocates on both sides.
As a follow-up, is there any law in the books in Utah that you consider unconstitutional and would not defend if it was challenged?
Well, one thing I'm really concerned about is the SB 54 that allows people to, purchase signatures, and I think there's some more questionable things about some of the people that gather signatures, whether they're committing fraud or not. It's created a problem, but the reason I question the constitutionality of that is because Senate Bill 54 is trying to regulate a private party, the Republican Party, and tell them how they can select their candidates. I don't believe that's constitutional. It's something I need to look at, but it's my duty, if I think something's not constitutional, to not defend it. If it's a question and it's not so clear, then that may be something that the court should resolve.
Are you aware of any instances of fraud when it comes to signature gathering? The reason I ask is because you brought it up.
Yeah, well, actually, it came up just recently. There was apparently an organization, and I don't have all the facts, that was prosecuted last year in the 2nd Congressional District campaign. And there was also, it was just brought up, that Senator Ibsen from Washington County, although he did not rely on signatures, my understanding is that he actually made it on the primary ballot against Chad Benyon, who had the majority. But it's my understanding that the person who gathered signatures for him is being investigated for fraud. So I think that this paying for signatures is a huge can of worms, that's what the law allows. So yes, I am increasingly concerned as to whether that same company was used in other races.
We asked Derek about the campaign donation issue that you raised
Yeah.
during the debate. He said he doesn't feel like, if he's getting money from a broad array of people, he's not beholden to any one group.
Yeah.
Do you want to take a swing at that?
Absolutely. You get large corporations. Why do you think Zions Bank gives 10 grand to somebody? Why does a PAC give you 100 grand to buy TV commercials? It's money is talking. What I'm really concerned about is it also fuels the problem of being able to buy an election. Where are the limits in this? Literally 100,000. That's way more of a donation than myself or Rachel Terry have. We don't have it anywhere near. And in fact, when I was at the state convention, I was earned 10 to 1. And I still was able to win at the convention, even though I had a jury trial that month of the convention. So I will say that if these companies, and the beer distributors from Washington, D.C. contributed to both of my competitors. Why does a beer distributor from Washington, D.C. want to give to a campaign unless they think they're buying some influence, right? I mean, look at some of these out-of-state contributions, and Derek has huge amounts of them. A lot of them in Las Vegas. We were trying to even check out who they were, and they were all like from one building. There's just questions that I think that you're safer, if you want to be ethical, to not receive donations from some of these corporations and some of these lobbying groups, because a lot of them are lobbying groups too, that he worked with when he was a lobbyist.
And that's our time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
about ready to begin. This is Terry. Campaign folks not associated with her should be out of the room by now. Let me see if we're okay to go. Anytime.
All right.
Okay.
So you raised a couple times during the debate Derek's previous work for Meta.
Right.
We asked him about it. He said he gave them legal advice, tried to get them to the table, but he would continue the suit. He doesn't see it as a conflict. Do you want to address that?
I do. So there's a couple of things. If you look at his lobbyist disclosures, they identify him as lobbying for Facebook, not being an attorney. When you're an attorney, you don't disclose legal work on your lobbying disclosures because they are very different. And the other thing that's really important to know is when you're an attorney, conflicts of interest continue. You can't just turn them off by saying, I don't represent them anymore. They continue indefinitely. So once I've represented a client as an attorney, I can't now take a contrary position to that client just because I have terminated representation. That's in the rules of ethics. It's in the rules of professional conduct. Every lawyer in the country knows that that's how conflicts work. And so that's a genuine concern to me, is that you can have a person who's leading an office who's one of the big cases that they're handling is social media and attacking, and addressing the harms of social media, when a person was representing social media companies for 6 years prior to taking office. And that's a legitimate concern and a conflict that I think the public need to be aware of, and dismissing it so haphazardly undermines the actual conflict that exists.
Toward the end, you also mentioned Derek's funding. Can you expand more on what you meant by that?
Yeah, so one of my concerns with the funding is when you get $50,000 from the governor, you get tens of thousands of dollars from legislators, from PACs. When you have to then take positions that may or may not be friendly, and sometimes, and most of the time, the Attorney General is lockstep with the governor and the legislature, but sometimes that's not true. And that undermines the independence of the Attorney General to be someone who is, I don't want to say bought, because that seems a little too sharp, but how can you be truly independent from the governor and the legislature when they asked you to run and then they financed your campaign and they're actively campaigning for you? Like, that's as close to being an appointed attorney general as I can imagine.
So would you not take any money from legislators or from PACs or from the governor if it was donated to your campaign?
I don't have to answer. That's not on the table right now. So I'm trying to think if there are any legislators. I have not been actively courting any funding from legislators or PACs. Most of my funding comes from people who know me personally. They're people who worked with me as an attorney, who've worked with me when I was with the League of Cities and Towns. They're people who are invested in because they've seen the work that I can do. And frankly, the governor has seen the work that I can do. I mean, just this week, I restructured the state's $1 billion insurance program in a way that is going to save school districts tens of millions of dollars for decades and make it so that they won't have to decrease their employee salaries. Like, the work that I do for the executive branch matters so much to me, whether it's working on litigation or solving difficult budget problems or working with my team to create improved productivity and improved morale. Like, these are the things that really matter to me, and it's the same kind of skills I want to bring to the Attorney General's office.
One endorsement you did mention during the debate was Ken Paxton's endorsement, which I know he was acquitted but he was impeached.
Yeah,
do you have?
He was almost impeached.
Well, I thought the House impeached him and the Senate acquitted him. But
Yeah, it
anyway,
was. Yeah.
Do you have any concerns about that being a big endorsement for you? I mean, I've seen it on some campaign literature before and so forth. Is it? I mean, how do you reconcile that?
So, I don't get to choose who sits at the table, but I get to choose how I interact with the people who are at the table. And there's no question that Ken Paxton has been a powerhouse in the conservative legal movement. So whatever his personal issues are within his own state. They don't directly impact the work that I want to do with him, which is working on the border issues, the fentanyl issues, technology issues. He's looking at Google and others and their impact on his state, on the social media issues. So I don't get to choose what his other issues are, but I do get to choose, but I am going to work with him. And one endorsement that I failed to mention that I really should have, because I think the ones that are closest to home are really the ones that matter the most, and that's the Fraternal Order of Police. Like, there are over 5,000 members in that organization. There are law enforcement officers. They're the people on the front lines when we deal with the human tragedies that come from the failure to secure the border. They're the ones who are dealing with the fentanyl issues, the domestic violence. And I'm so grateful that they endorsed me. Every candidate was interviewed and vetted by the Fraternal Order of Police in the same meeting, and I was really grateful for their endorsement. And so the endorsements of those who have seen specifically the work I can do and actually know how I can impact the state of Utah are truly meaningful to me.
Did Trump get a fair trial and fair verdict?
Well, I want to separate sort of the issues there, because I think the jury did what they were asked to do. But what they were asked to do was to rule on a case that required cobbling together misdemeanor laws in order to create a felony. There wasn't a specific felony charge on the books that they could go after Trump with. They had to pull a bunch of things together. And then they had a prosecutor who had been very explicit that it was his mission to convict Trump. They had a judge who we know had some conflicts of interest. And then there was a jury instruction that didn't even require the jury to identify the secondary felony to support the first felony, which is unheard of. And so I don't blame the jurors, but I do blame the prosecutor for cobbling together something. And what's most troubling about it is the nation sees this as a very politicized prosecution, which means it makes them feel, it undermines their confidence and trust in the judicial system.
Do you see it as a very politicized prosecution?
I do. When you say as part of your campaign, I'm going to go after Trump and I'm going to prosecute him, I'm going to take him down, and then you do exactly that, but you can't do it in a clean and clear way by utilizing the statutes as they are traditionally applied, and you have to cobble it together, then yes, it is a politicized prosecution.
Do you feel like you broke the law based on what you know?
I don't know enough about the individual fact patterns that they were applying in that specific case. It seems, based on my read of it, that there were some improprieties in terms of reporting and such, but not like felony level charges. I mean, these just weren't, and that's the other thing that's so important. When you say it's a felony, that's a big deal. And when you change it so that it's something small, then the felony doesn't mean what it's supposed to mean. And when you have that prosecutorial discretion and power, you should be so careful with how you use it instead of saying, I'm going to use my power to go after this one person. That's inappropriate.
What are some other instances of unfairness that you see in the justice system?
One concern that I have specifically with the justice system, and I've heard this from Utahns all over the state, is when, from both police, from victims, and also those who are charged, when it comes to the prosecutions, are we making sure that the charges are tailored to the actual crimes? Are we overcharging people just to pressure them into pleading out? I don't think that that's helpful. It doesn't create trust. But on the other hand, are we prosecuting crimes that deserve to be prosecuted? For example, I heard from several women who said that their partner was in and out of jail, booked in and out of jail before they even finished giving their victim statement. And so they didn't feel like they could even go home. That means that the justice system isn't protecting the most vulnerable. And then the police, when they conduct an investigation and they are bringing the charge to their county attorney and nothing happens, especially when we're dealing with crimes of violence, of sexual assault, domestic violence, battery and abuse, and child abuse, it means that we're not doing a good job.
On the response to the abortion question, you told your personal story, and you said it should be up to women to make these decisions on their own. Those weren't your exact words,
Yeah.
but words to that effect. How does that square with the law that's currently before the court that would say no abortion after a heartbeat? I mean, it seems like that takes that personal aspect out of it.
Yeah, there are limitations, right? There is a point where a woman's choice is taking away someone else's choice. That child who would choose to live if they could control their own destiny. And one of the things that I was specifically referencing too is, it's been politicized, these discussions about contraception and about IVF. Well, one of the great things about Utah is that families want to grow, and making sure that they can access the medical interventions that they need to grow. And we have seen Democrats try to create the fear that we won't have access to contraception, that we won't have access to IVF here in Utah. Other states have resolved that in a different way. But I think in Utah, the way the abortion bill was written is not going to undermine access to contraception, is not going to access to medical interventions to grow your family. And I think that's important to protect those so that women can choose when and how to grow their families.
And that's our time. Thank you.
Okay.